Welcome to the Sharing the Faith podcast, where every other week we explore the beauty and power of faith in Jesus Christ, the light of the world. Now here is your host, Dr. Tom Neal.
This is Dr. Tom Neal with another episode of Sharing the Faith, which is a production of the Diocese of Pensacola-Tallahassee. It is a great pleasure to be with you today. This podcast is at the service of the Church's mission to preach the gospel to all nations and show the impact the gospel has on every aspect of human life. And today, one of the things we will speak about is human life and its dignity, particularly at its beginnings, at its inception in the womb. And I have a dear friend, longtime friend, for well over 20 years, Dr. Damon Cudihy, who presently lives over in Lafayette, Louisiana. I've asked to come on the show today, and I'll tell you a little bit more about him. But Dr. Damon, thank you so much for being with us today. It's a pleasure to have you.
You're welcome, Tom. Thank you for having me. It's a real joy and an honor to be with you and to do another interview with you again in a different forum.
Same, yes. And we go back. When I was in Des Moines years ago, we did a podcast show or a radio show together before. And we've had many other conversations and worked together in the past.
Absolutely.
But what I'd like to do, well, first of all, I have to say that people who watch this show, you'll see that I have some facial hair now. And the whole reason I grew this was so that I could be like Dr. Damon, who I look up to here. And I said to him before the show, the only thing I think I've actually beat him at is that I actually have a fully white beard and he's only partially white.
That's right. So I look forward to looking more like my mentor and role model and hero and Dr. Tom Neal as time goes on.
We'll aspire to each other's beards. I like this. This could be a whole future around this.
That's right.
Well, I'd like to begin I'd like to share with our listeners, Dr. Damon, if you don't mind, your bio, and I want to read all of it just because you have such an extensive background, and this is, I hope, a series of conversations we have into the future, so people can kind of know a little bit more about you. So Dr. Damon Cudihy is a National Merit Scholar who earned a dual bachelor's in biology and Spanish from Florida State University in 1999. He went on to obtain his Doctor of Medicine at the University of Florida, which was very difficult for a Seminole to do, by the way, but he accomplished it.
It was.
Amid Gators in 2003. During his second year of medical school, Dr. Cudihy was awarded a Health Professions Scholarship and commission in the U.S. Army's Medical Services Corps. His postgraduate medical training began at the San Antonio Uniformed Services Health Education Consortium, where he completed 2 years of specialty training in obstetrics and gynecology. Dr. Cudihy went on to fulfill his military service obligation as a field surgeon, during which he volunteered for an overseas deployment in July of 2006. In Iraq, Dr. Captain Cudihy served as battalion surgeon, where his duties included providing medical care to hundreds of Iraqi civilians during various medical missions. After returning from Iraq in September 2007 and finishing his military commitment, Dr. Cudihy continued specialty training at the State University of New York at Buffalo, affiliated Sisters of Charity Hospital. Then he completed his residency training in obstetrics and gynecology in 2009, June. Before moving to Lafayette, Dr. Cudihy worked as a staff obstetrician and gynecologist at Holy Spirit Hospital's Center for Women's Health in Camp Hill, Pennsylvania, for 4 years. During this time, Holy Spirit Hospital acquired the latest Da Vinci robotic surgery system, and Dr. Cudihy had become the hospital's most prolific surgeon utilizing this advanced technology. Furthermore, he proctored other surgeons in the region as a teaching consultant for robot-assisted minimally invasive surgery. In addition to the pathology and treatment of preeclampsia, his academic and professional interests include the treatment of infertility, endometriosis, and the advancement of minimally invasive surgery. In August 2013, Dr. Cudihy was presented with an opportunity to start a private practice and founded Acadiana OBGYN. He feels that the move was divine providence, God calling him and his family to move to Acadiana, to serve and become a part of this wonderful community. In 2010, he was awarded the Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology's Dennis Hawkins Memorial Award for a research paper on the cause of preeclampsia. He is also a local advocate for women's health, having been extensively quoted in the local press on issues ranging from prenatal screening tests to fertility awareness and family planning. On the national and international level, he has been featured on such outlets as the Station of the Cross Catholic Radio, Radio Maria, and EWTN television. Since moving to Louisiana, Dr. Cudihy has testified before the state legislature regarding various bills touching on life issues, has served as an expert witness for the Louisiana Department of Health and Hospitals in federal court in defense of abortion regulations, and became a regular guest lecturer at Notre Dame Seminary, where I was employed at the time. Dr. Cudihy currently serves as the medical director for both the Natural Birth House and, pardon my pronunciation, DeOrmeau, is that right? DeSormeau Foundation's Women's Health Center in Lafayette. He is on the board of the Acadiana Breastfeeding Coalition and the DeSormeau Foundation and Acadiana Homeschool Athletics, which I love that. Getting close to the end here, Dr. Cudihy is currently a member of, and I'm going to work at these pronunciations, International Institute of Restorative and Reproductive Medicine, the American Association of Gynecologic Laparoscopists, Society of Laparoendoscopic Surgeons, Catholic Medical Association, American Association of Pro-Life Obstetricians and Gynecologists, a former fellow of the American Congress of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, and a diplomat of the American Board of Obstetrics and Gynecology. Lastly, but certainly not least, his personal life. Dr. Cudihy is a sometimes now runner, but a regular CrossFit practitioner. He also enjoys spending time outdoors with his children. Loves his family, by the way, very much. Camping, backpacking, kayaking, dirt bike riding, hunting, and fishing. This guy, he's unbelievable. I'm telling you, one day when I grow up, I'm going to be like Dr. Cudihy. No, I won't. I'm too old. Above all else, though, Dr. Cudihy's most important roles are those as husband to his wife, Lauren, for over 23 years, as he says, without whom he would not be an OBGYN physician, and father of their 8 wonderful children, who continually remind him of the generosity and love of God. That's beautiful, by the way, just to read that as an opportunity for people to get to know you, your story and your history. So, and hopefully other episodes, we'll be able to talk about that unfolding journey that I just kind of read through there. But what I would like to do today, if you don't mind jumping right to the meat of the show, Dr. Cudihy, is an article you wrote for Aletheia. I don't know exactly how you pronounce that, Aletheia or Aletheia, however it's pronounced.
I think I've heard it, Aletheia, I think that's one way I've heard it. But
and it's called An OBGYN Gives 7 Reasons IVF is a Bad Idea. IVF stands for in vitro fertilization. So we've talked over the years a lot about this topic. This is a difficult topic to talk about in American culture. And I really appreciate in this article the way that you talk about it. So what I'd like you to do at first, if you wouldn't mind, is just kind of lay out what exactly is IVF, kind of maybe some basics there. And then we'll get into a couple at least of the reasons you give for it being what you call a bad idea.
Sure. And just and one of the things that prompted the writing of this article, or the invitation by the editor to write it, was the recent Alabama Supreme Court decision. This was back this year, February 16th, and it created kind of national shockwaves and ignited somewhat of a discussion, but it was largely one-sided, unfortunately, about IVF, where the majority of the nation, even otherwise pro-life individuals, wanting to give some kind of tacit endorsement to it. So, yeah, it's incredibly important that we have just a real clear and frank discussion about what IVF actually entails and the history of it. So its origins are somewhat nefarious when you really get down to it. But what it stands for, in vitro fertilization, that basically means that we are allowing conception, creating the conditions for the conception of a human being to occur outside of the human body, outside of its natural process. And it's often described as test tube babies, but the reality is these children are actually conceived in a petri dish, the same way that we are going to grow fungus or bacteria to test antibiotics or other types of things. So, already we can start to see some of the hints of how inhuman a process this is. But and it's been promoted as the best treatment for infertility. But what it really is, it's a treatment bypassing the natural process of conception. And for any of those who've read the book Brave New World, it's kind of fascinating that in that sort of dystopian, futuristic scenario, this is the only means by which human beings reproduce, is through this technological process of in vitro fertilization. One of the heroes of the book, this couple, they're described as savages because they actually conceive through natural, marital intercourse and have a child conceived in the woman's womb rather than in the laboratory in the factory, so to speak. So it is something that has become increasingly prominent, and it's being promoted to women as the answer to all of their problems. A lot of IVF centers will promote themselves as fertility treatment clinics. There's one prominent one nearby where I practice that calls themselves Fertility Answers. Unfortunately, most patients don't realize the only answer any patient is given, and it typically is IVF, as if that's the only answer, regardless of the cause of her infertility. And I can't emphasize enough how much of an injustice and a disservice this is to women, because as I describe and when I write about this, that no woman desires, has thoughts and dreams of having a child conceived by IVF. Women end up, submitting themselves to the IVF process out of desperation. And I think there's a parallel to how a lot of women end up at abortion centers, at abortion clinics, that they do this not because they feel it's their free choice among many choices, but they feel they have no other choice. And that's even more true, I think, of IVF than abortion, where women are literally led to believe by all the physicians that they come into contact with that if they are to conceive, this is the only choice they have. And so, as one of the things that has been a unique aspect of my approach to medicine as an obstetrician and gynecologist, along with my other colleagues that share the same philosophy as Catholics or faithful Christians, is being contraception free and recognizing that a woman's fertility is a healthy condition, not a disease that we need to suppress or alter surgically or chemically. And that itself is, puts me outside the mainstream quite a bit. And I was, in my time in Tallahassee as a college student, I was well formed in the church's teachings on the dignity of human life, particularly John Paul II, and what he taught about the nature of marriage and marital love, the purposes of marital intercourse being both procreative and unitive, and all of that. And what I have seen in my practice in dealing with hundreds of women suffering from infertility is and just an incredibly powerful witness of that truth that St. Paul VI talks about in Humanae Vitae, the encyclical that affirmed the church's condemnation of contraception and sterilization. And Pope Paul VI, referring to, he says, children are the supreme gift of marriage. And so it's one thing to read that in an encyclical and to be able to assent to that intellectually and to see the logic of that. But in my practice, I have been even more deeply convicted of that over the past decades, of seeing the suffering of women in my office that are grieving, literally to tears. I probably end up passing the box of Kleenex to patients more often when they're telling me their story of infertility than even patients that are diagnosed with a miscarriage, as tragic as that is. But there's a deep suffering that women in particular I see when they've never been able to conceive. And that points to the good. They're suffering from the deprivation of a good, the good of children and marriage. And so I'd like to make the point that my personal experience, my lived experience, has affirmed this truth that the church teaches about what fertility is as a good thing, as the greatest gift in marriage. One of the most remarkable, incredible things that a layperson can be a part of is cooperating with God to create a new immortal soul, a future citizen of heaven. So I think that's important to start out with, because some of the things that we're going to need to say, may otherwise sound very harsh and condemnatory of people who end up finding themselves at the IVF clinics. But I think it is important to acknowledge that there's a natural good, a God-given desire for children that actually ends up creating a vulnerability that can be exploited, by the IVF industry.
Sure. Yeah, and what I appreciate, so first of all, those distinctions are really important in terms of just obviously the moral issues, but I really appreciate also, as you begin the article, not with addressing what you consider what's wrong with IVF, its moral, evils and so on, but you begin with the reality of human suffering that is brought with the crisis, the cross, the suffering of infertility, and the desire to have a child, which is a beautiful thing. And what motivates, that women, for example, or men and women who go to these IVF clinics is a desire for something very, very good. But your point is that medical science is providing a pseudo solution. And the beauty of what you do is you don't just simply condemn the medical kind of pseudo solution. You provide an alternative that you've invested so much of your life, and you want more of the medical profession to invest its energies into to make better what you do in terms of addressing fertility issues. So go ahead and maybe the 7 reasons you give for why it's bad. The fourth one addresses this thing here, which is is IVF is not addressing actually infertility at all. So would you talk about that?
Yeah, and that's the real disservice, is that it's a very quick. It's a very quick step to bypass all the possible causes. There's a sort of a cursory, series of tests that the women are generally subjected to, and it just, I want to interject that a lot of my understanding of the inside of the industry comes from both personal experience, having trained at the military program that had a very active IVF clinic going on. And so, but then the other more recently is that I see many patients who have been mistreated by the IVF industry and then come to me as, after having been there. They've gone through IVF or started the process. So I've heard from hundreds of patients just over the past 10 years that have told me their story. And I've become very familiar with what actually happens on the ground level. So they go there because they haven't been able to conceive. And they are promised by their general practitioner that this is the doctor, these are the specialists that are going to take care of you. So they'll do some cursory tests. One of them, they'll test them for STDs. Very few of them have actually had STDs that are a cause of infertility. So that's, another one of these cursory things. This is where it gets interesting. They'll often do a test to check to see if the woman's fallopian tubes are open. And that can be a cause of infertility. But here's where it gets interesting. Regardless of the outcome of this test, it's called an HSG, hysterosalpingogram. They inject dye. If the woman's tubes are blocked, which is rare, but sometimes it's a cause, then the IVF doctor will tell her, well, your tubes are blocked. You have what's called tubal factor infertility. The best thing for you is IVF. It gets even more interesting. If her tubes are open, which is the majority, at least 95% or more of women that go to them and have this test, the tubes will be open, patent. And the doctor will tell them, well, your tubes are open. You have unexplained infertility. The best treatment is IVF. So that kind of begs the question, why even do the test if you're going to recommend IVF either way? And there's lots of reasons. I mean, there's an extra $1,000 cash that the office is making for sure. And there's the sort of the appearance of looking for causes of the disease. So, and I really lament that I think my profession has retrogressed in terms of our ability to actually give proper analysis and treatment for the causes of infertility. We've gone backwards, in other words. I think that 30, 40 years ago, before IVF was more of experimental and really at its beginning, doctors were doing more to look for underlying causes of infertility. And what I've seen in my work, 2 things kind of come to the surface as the most common causes of infertility that are underappreciated and almost never, very rarely treated properly. One of them is, and they have very unique approaches A big one is endometriosis, and this also is associated with pelvic pain, sometimes very minimal pain, sometimes no pain. It only causes infertility. The difficulty with endometriosis, however, is that there's not really a treatment today, even with our best technology, that doesn't require surgery. So it does require surgery to adequately diagnose and determine whether or not a woman has endometriosis. But the good thing is that same surgery to diagnose it, can also be the opportunity, a time when the surgical treatment to cure the woman of endometriosis can be brought about. And that's one of the specialty areas of my practice. And that's why I've become very interested in minimally invasive surgery. I really try to adhere to that Hippocratic principle of doing no harm, which I take also to mean that if I do need to operate, I want to do as little harm as possible. So I try to do typically only 3 small incisions, laparoscopically outpatient. I try to do it efficiently, not have the patient under general anesthesia any longer than necessary. So that's something I've really worked hard to perfect in my surgical skill, so that I can provide the healing that will restore the woman's fertility and also alleviate pain that's often associated with that. So that's one big cause, and I find that my colleagues, and it has to do with our training, we really don't get a lot of training, and the awareness of endometriosis as a cause of fertility is really low. There's lots of interest groups. It'll come up in different online blogs and Facebook groups and that sort of thing. But by and large, it's not well appreciated, even among the medical community. So that's primarily a surgical problem where it requires surgical intervention. The other one would be a condition called polycystic ovarian syndrome. And even though it might sound like this would be something that's painful, it's usually not a condition associated with pain, but not ovulating. And that's increasingly common today. And that has more of a hormonal issue that can usually be treated with medication and addressing the underlying causes hormonally of why the woman's not ovulating. And so those are the 2 most common things I see that in my practice, even patients who failed IVF or lesser procedures like artificial insemination called IUI, I've had quite a number of patients over the years, easily 100, if I had to just pick a number, who have successfully conceived when we took the basic medical approach of determining an underlying cause, correcting it, restoring normal function of her body, her reproductive system, and then she's able to conceive naturally. And so that, I can't emphasize enough, what a sorrow this is for me to see women suffering this many times, this deprivation of being denied or not having access to proper treatment and evaluation.
And do you is there a network of doctors in the United States that are engaged in the way you are in this kind of approach to IVF, but more just to fertility treatments? Is this something you see growing, or is this?
It is growing somewhat. And in my experience, it's come primarily out of doctors, interestingly enough, that are like-minded and seeing fertility as a good thing. So oftentimes the same doctors that are not going to be prescribing contraception and doing sterilizations, those are the ones that are most familiar. Doctors who have done training and with the NAPRO technology approach are particularly ones that you're very familiar with it. But it's not exclusive. With regard to NAPRO technology, it's been a very good formative role in my education, but unfortunately, I think it's being held out there as like the only group of doctors. So I think it's important that we see more broadly that those aren't the only doctors that have expertise in this. There's a very well connected Facebook group called Nancy's Nook. And there's a great Catholic surgeon out of St. Louis, Dr. Patrick Young, who had helped me get affiliated with that group. And so there's patients that come to me from out of town, out of state, even just based on that connection. And this is a group of women that are just looking for a surgeon that is equipped and appreciates the role of endometriosis as a cause of infertility. It doesn't have any kind of Catholic or Christian ethos necessarily in terms of a faith position, but they're just looking for actual causes of both pain and infertility. So Nancy's Nook is a unique one there. So I think it is growing, but slowly in terms of the appreciation. And I think that as time goes on with the internet and social media, women suffering from these conditions are able to share, with each other. And so I've seen my practice grow tremendously over the past decade here in Lafayette based on that. A lot of the referrals I get, probably the majority of referrals, are from friends and other patients. Women talk, so to speak, and they, by nature, are much more willing to share with each other their experiences. And so that's a good thing. I've really benefited from that, or my patients have anyway.
Excellent. That's excellent. Well, I'd like to get into some of the initial reasons in the article that you list as to why IVF is a bad idea, and these are moral and medical issues, human issues as well. But again, just to emphasize what you say at the beginning of your article, about the goodness of the intention that people bring to IVF. They want to do something good. They want to address something that's genuinely across a suffering and something that should be but isn't. But also the goodness and beauty of the children conceived of IVF, regardless of the means by which someone is conceived. A human being is precious and infinitely worthwhile and is not tainted by that in themselves at all.
Right.
I think that's always important, because when you speak to people, for example, who may have children already who are conceived by IVF or themselves conceived by IVF, which I know, for example, is happening in Catholic schools where teachers bring this moral issue up, and one of the children in the class, the young women or men, is that, just to be aware of that, the dignity is not at all. And you say that in your article.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, because that's very important that we address that right up front. I want to say, but before that, though, I think that Cardinal Ratzinger, later Pope Benedict, but while he was still a cardinal and prefect of the Congregation of Doctrine of Faith, wrote a very clear document for the benefit of the church when this issue came up, called Donum Vitae, Latin for gift of life. And I think in that title itself, it really sums up our approach to the child, accepting the child as a gift. Because, and there's between contraception and IVF, you have two errors on either side of that. With contraception, the child is seen as a disease, a burden to be avoided at all costs, even to the point of destroying it. And with IVF, the child is seen more or less as a right and entitlement, something that we can, we can seek to achieve by all means, by any cost. So I think a proper appreciation that, is to see the child as a gift, not either of those other errors. But I think it's also a good, ethical thing to point out that the means by which an individual is created does not illegitimize their existence. So otherwise, we'd have to say that anyone that was born outside of wedlock or that was conceived in the setting of an adultery, that child would somehow not have the same dignity as the rest of us, and that's of course not the case. Even in the tragic situation of sexual assault and rape, even those children, the same dignity as you and I. So it's worth making the point always that we are not in any way degrading the value of this individual child, this human being, because of the means by which they were conceived.
Yes.
So I think that's a good point to reiterate.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for that. So the very first reason you give, the heading to that is killing to create. And so this is an important point to consider from a Catholic moral teaching issue, but just in terms of just factual kind of approach to what exactly happens at IVF. So maybe you could explain a little bit about what's going on there and then what the moral issue is.
Yeah. And I was really struck when Dr. Thomas Silgers, a good mentor of mine, the founder of the Natural Technology Approach, when he said in a presentation once, he said, quote, IVF is killing babies to make babies. And what did he mean by that? Well, it turns out the overwhelming majority of children created in these petri dishes never will survive. And the vast majority, 96% of them, to be exact, is best we can get out of a number, will either die intentionally by selection as being judged low quality embryos, undesirable chromosomal status, a type of eugenics. But it's also known that only a small percentage will survive, even if there's an attempt for them all or the conditions made possible. And so, but I think that that's what we need to realize, that there's a real callousness, a real coldness of heart that has to be present in the physicians involved to be willing to sacrifice 96 children so that 4 can survive, or 25 so that 1 can survive, however you want to look at it. And so it's a matter of numbers, basically, and it's a real hard. It's a real sobering look at the utilitarian, philosophy that, this sort of, calculating, inhuman and personally degrading attitude about individual human life. And so one of the founders of IVF, there was two involved. One was an actual OBGYN physician who did abortions at his part-time. And when you look into the history, you learn that he was actually funding his IVF experiments with the profits he was making by doing abortions on the side. This guy, Patrick Steptoe, he also was developing new innovative ways of sterilizing women. He did a lot of advancing of the laparoscopic, the minimally invasive approach of doing tubal sterilization. And so, sadly, a lot of the early laparoscopic surgery was developed in the gynecology profession for the purpose of sterilizing women. So you've got this doctor that's trying to, find new and more efficient ways of sterilizing women that has no moral compunction against killing innocent children via abortion. And he's the one that is also doing this experiment to try to create human life or to allow conception to occur in a petri dish. So I think it's a good historical lesson to see that it takes a very hardened conscience with no sense of proper ethical standards to even allow this to begin. And so this wasn't a man who had dedicated his life for the seeking causes of treating infertility. He didn't dedicate himself to treating fertility. It was really, sadly, a very cynical approach to human life where children were just seen as a means to an end and willing to sacrifice children that were judged by the parents or the state to be inconvenient or undesirable.
And that leads into your second point, actually, which is treating an entire class of human beings as property, as things that are owned and marketed, even sold, bought,
sure,
et cetera. So I want to talk about that, but just maybe as an intervening point, just to emphasize the Catholic teaching, and then yourself as a scientist, doctor. Human life begins at conception. At the moment of conception, we believe that a human being has full humanity, right? That God creates a soul, nothing, and then infuses that soul into the newly conceived human being, the zygote, whatever that would be called at that stage, and that human being is not less of a human being than an adult, but also just, biologically looking at a newly conceived human being, the fullness of that person is already present in some way. So just realizing that is what we're talking about, not just eggs, because there's a lot of, language manipulation that happens around what.
Good point. I'm glad you bring that up because one of the ways that this reality of the majority of children conceived by IVF willingly being destroyed or allowed to die or expected to die is that many times there'll be semantics that are very misleading. So you'll hear IVF doctors talk about fertilized embryos. There's actually no such thing as a fertilized embryo any more than there is such thing as a fertilized adult. You just say you or I are fertilized. What does that mean? We got some, mulch thrown on our head. And so once the process of fertilization has occurred and you have the sperm united to the one sperm and one egg and the complement of DNA, we're no longer talking about the proper term would be embryo or zygote, if you want to be precise, depending on how many days after that conception event, a fertilization event occurs. And I think it's important for us as Catholics to realize that this is about intellectual honesty. The assertion that life begins at conception, at that one cell stage immediately following fertilization, that's not a point of Catholic doctrine so much as it is of scientific consensus about what conception is. And this was made very clear soon after the dawn of the microscope technology in the late 1800s. So about 100 years before Roe v. Wade in 1973, we knew actually when life began, even though the majority of the Supreme Court justices actually dishonestly claimed we didn't know. So I think we're reverting back to that, dishonest lie, that lie that we don't know when life begins, or that to believe that life begins at conception is somehow a Catholic doctrine. Our Catholic faith, like many other faiths, merely asserts that it is always and everywhere wrong to intentionally kill an innocent human being. So when those three criteria are met, the humanity, this is a human being, the killing is intentional, and they're innocent, then that's always and everywhere wrong. That's a universal truth. And so I think that it's important that when we're debating these issues that we really are clear about what the matter is. There should be no dispute about when human life begins. And that's kind of what we saw after this Alabama Supreme Court ruling, that there were a lot of people that felt a little bit squeamish about taking a position against IVF. They wanted to just jump to the fact that, well, some women have children, some of these children do survive, and this are the way that some families, and they really were intentionally turning a blind eye to the fact that the overwhelming majority of children created in this process do die, and many of them intentionally so, if not the majority of them.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that clarification. And so moving on to the property, the image of number 2 here, treating an entire class of humans as property. So in what sense is that the case, do you see?
So and I described in a second article, is there's a sort of a culling process where these human embryos, and they may end up with 12 or 20 in the petri dish. And so the first stage, under very arbitrary criteria, actually, the embryologist will look at the embryos under a microscope and they will give them a grade. There's a numeric number, then two letters afterwards, something like 3BC or 4AB. And the grade is an attempt to predict the likelihood that this particular embryo will survive to full term. And so the ones that are graded as lower, you could almost imagine this is like an agricultural prize. Also, you're grading eggs, grade A eggs, grade B eggs, or grade A chickens, or maybe that the ones that are on the lower end of the grading process are usually thrown in the trash. And the word trash is something that has always stuck with me, because I actually heard an IVF doctor use that literal word to describe what they do to the so-called spare embryos. That, quote, he said, we throw them in the trash. He was actually saying this to the potential parents of someone that was going to them for supposed infertility treatment. So that's the first way in which we're treating them as less than human, as property. But even more explicitly, when you have, for example, very typically wealthy couples, celebrities, actors, that sort of thing, divorce rate, as we know, is very high. So what happens when this couple has 20 or so embryos in cryopreservation and liquid nitrogen? And the court precedent has been pretty consistent already that these human beings, unlike children that are born, are treated according to family law. What are the interests of the children? But when you're talking about the children that are frozen in liquid nitrogen, these children are treated as property. And so, one spouse might get the house, one might get the car, one might get the vacation house, one might get 10 embryos, one might get 5 embryos. So they're sort of divvied up as any other type of property. And so that's another sort of regression culturally. One of the most shameful parts of our American history is treating an entire class of human beings as property. Sadly, during the time of slavery, we treated human beings as property, and we've gone back to that shameful practice now, and as in order to continue the IVF industry.
Yes. And the last thing you mentioned, we'll talk about just because of time. And I'd like to, as I said, continue this conversation further and extend out into other issues of fertility, health, and the kind of things that you deal with in your practice. But the idea of using people as guinea pigs, which is the next phrase you use there, that's an interesting phrase. Yeah. So maybe explain, to the listeners what exactly you're talking about there.
Sure. Yeah. So again, we're dealing with this can only happen when you have a superabundance of embryos. And so since the majority don't survive, they're always going to try to, create as many human embryos as possible. Again, people without a formed conscience, are not going to be concerned about doing experiments on human beings. We saw that, in the 1930s, with a very corrupt government doing experiments in Germany on living human beings. And you could have these scientists that would justify it because we're getting scientific knowledge. And so these people are going to be killed anyway. We're going to kill them in the gas chambers. So we may as well get some medical information from them before we kill them. That's a similar kind of, rationale behind the destructive research on human embryos from IVF clinics. There's this idea, this utilitarianistic view that, well, these embryos are going to be destroyed anyway. We may as well go ahead and use them for medical research. And so we're doing experiments and testing different drugs, the toxicity of the drugs, how well a particular vaccine might work. These human embryos are basically becoming medical research material. So they're sold to the pharmaceutical industry typically for research and then other. So that's a situation where and sometimes, again, it's a selling point, ironically, to the parents. They'll be promised that, well, the extra embryos are going to be used to find a cure for disease. But the reality is, these embryos, once they have perished, once we're talking about a corpse, they're no longer that valuable. So it's actually the living embryos that are sought after as the most valuable material for scientific experimentation. It's the living human being, and a heart and conscience that is most valuable for doing these unethical experiments on. And that's pretty mainstream. That's not, that's not something that happens, in the back alley abortion center. This is, part and parcel of the IVF industry, today.
Excellent. Well, as we move close to the end of our time, Dr. Cudihy, two things I wanted to ask. First of all, if people wanted to learn more about your practice and what you do, or even reach out to you for questions, what does that look like? How do they do that?
Sure. My website is acadianaobgyn.com. That's let's see if I can spell that. I got it, read it off. It's acadianaobgyn.com. And they can certainly reach out to me, if they want to invite me to a speaking event or to see me as a patient through that website. At info@acadianaobgyn.com would be the best email address to get in touch with me. My office manager gets those emails and she'll send those to me if anyone wants to reach out to me. And I've tried to, I need to update it, but I've tried to have on my website some resources, to point people in the right direction, and I may even be able to post this interview, for example, on that website as well.
Excellent. Very, very good. That's really helpful. And any kind of information people might want to read on fertility treatments, would you have any resources on there or point them in any direction on what there is out there, options, consideration?
I would, for people that are on Facebook, I could point to them to Nancy's Nook. That would be probably a good location to find a surgeon that properly addresses endometriosis in a what we call an excisional approach, trying to excise the endometriosis. Another network, physicians who have had training in NAPRO technology, particularly OBGYNs, which are a small minority of those. Those are generally good resources if it's a physician. And there's an organization called the Fertility Care Centers Network that falls under the NAPRO technology world. There's a couple of other similar organizations, one called FEMM, F-E-M-M, Fertility Education and Medical Management. These are also physicians that are seeking to take an actual proper approach to diagnosing underlying causes. They're going to be focusing more on the medical side, addressing the underlying causes of PCOS. But I think between those three groups, most women should, if there's someone local available to them, they should be able to find someone to help them better.
Excellent. And lastly, I just want to say from knowing you all these years and the many, many conversations we've had, one of the things I really appreciate about your practice as a doctor, that you view your practice as a vocation, right? This is a calling that God has given you to serve human health, human life, and particularly women's health, and the gifts that God gives to them and supporting them. And one of the things that stands out to me is that you get to see the most painful parts of human life come through your office and through your own practice, and some of the most joyful aspects of human life, right? You share with me, tragic situations that you women have been through, or you having to deal with surgical situations, which are very hard or complicated, but if you had to describe at the end, what is that experience like, being so close to the kind of heart of where human life begins, and the joys and the sorrows around that?
Yeah, I'll just share what I like to share with other friends and even patients. So patients often ask me if the greatest part of the greatest joy in my work is being able to deliver a newborn child. And there is a certain joy in that, and I do enjoy that. Although sometimes that's at 2 or 3 a.m. and I'm very tired and exhausted. So I don't always have the same appreciation for that as I do this other event I'm going to share. Probably the singular most joy-filled moments in my practice are when I see a patient coming to me for her first OB visit, and we're doing an ultrasound to confirm that the baby is alive and well, and also if there's uncertainty about how far along she is. So usually this is around 7, 8, maybe 9 weeks. The baby's only 1.5 to 2 centimeters, about the size of a gummy bear, as I describe it, and probably similar proportions of a big head and small arms and legs. And being able to show that couple their child on the ultrasound, the beauty of the technology at the service of human dignity, of humankind. And we have a screen on the wall so the patients can see it enlarged. Being able to show those patients their child they've been longing for, they've been praying for, like in the gospel last week, they've expended all their resources on physicians. They've spent all their money on finding physicians for this, trying to address it, and they haven't been able to. But then when it's a patient that I had just recently, in the past few months, taken to the operating room and done this minimally invasive surgery to treat endometriosis, and then they come back to me, 2 or 3 months later with a living child, still tiny, the joy in their eyes, the tears, the gratitude, the appreciation, that to me is honestly one of the greatest joys of my life right now. And I thank God for it.
Wow.
So
well,
that's
thank you so much for sharing that, and just
You're welcome.
just for your dedication to your family, your wife, your beautiful wife Lauren, and your children, and to these people of Acadia, and in this case, but so many people beyond that you've touched through your many works, your writings, and just your life. So I thought we'd end with a prayer, and I'd ask you to lead it. It's one of the only prayers I think we have in our tradition that mentions womb in it. So I thought the Hail Mary might be a great way to end. So if you I'll just listen, but if you could lead that as a conclusion.
Sure. All right. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. The Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Amen. Again, Dr. Damon Cudihy, thank you so much for taking this time today out of your practice and giving us your wisdom, and look forward to the next time we get to see you and hear from you.
I do. I'll look forward to it as well. God bless you, Tom.
This has been another edition of Sharing the Faith, a production of the Diocese of Pensacola-Tallahassee. Dr. Tom Neal, looking forward to seeing you again in 2 weeks. Please join us always as we share the gospel.
Thank you for tuning in today to the Sharing the Faith podcast. If you would like to learn more about the podcast, visit ptdiocese.org/sharingthefaith. If you listen to the audio version through an app such as Apple Podcast, Spotify, or iHeartRadio, be sure to rate, review, and comment. If you watched on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe or leave a comment on the episode. Thank you for listening.